Tonight on Nation to Nation, funding from the federal government to search for unmarked graves has been in the spotlight recently. Dr. Kimberly Murray says future funding is uncertain and current funding increasingly comes with strings attached.
And it seems to be changing on a monthly basis of what you're able to use the dollars for.
Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay says Canada has reached a critical crossroads in its long fractured relationship between Indigenous people and police forces.
But provincial territorial police forces have yet to even come to the table on reconciliation. So what do we need? I'm actually scared to ask the question.
NDP MP Nikki Ashton says the Northern Manitoba First Nation had no other option but to take the Trudeau government to the Supreme Court for its repeated failure to provide safe drinking water to the community.
And they're fighting Canada. Canada, who under the Liberal government has said repeatedly that they were deeply committed to moving away from boiled water advisories.
Welcome to the new season of Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. It was a busy summer on the political scene, and it promises to be a busy fall in Ottawa as federal election looms. So much to talk about, you won't want to miss our show this year. The Trudeau government has landed itself in hot water recently over funding for searches of unmarked graves on the sites of former residential schools. Organizations like the Survivors Secretariat say there is much less money for searches than before. They say $91 million over the next 2 years, which would be about a 58% cut from the $216.6 million that was available over the last 3 years. Joining us today to talk about this and other issues is Kimberly Murray, the special interlocutor for missing children, unmarked graves, and burial sites. So thanks for joining us, and welcome back to Nation Nation, Ms. Murray.
Thank you.
So I thought I would start first with the funding. Now, as you know, the federal government did restore the cap per community, I think, to $3 million after there's some public outcry about the $500,000. But is this $91 million over the next 2 years? Is that actually what's available?
That's my understanding. The government actually hasn't provided me a briefing on the funding. So all I know is what is available publicly. And the Minister of Cernak has not contacted me to let me know about what's happening. I do have concerns about the funding. I have raised this with the government, both in my interim report and over the last 2 years, that there has to be sustainable funding for these searches. They are continue to limit what communities can utilize the funding for. And it seems to be changing on a monthly basis of what you're able to use the dollars for. At the end of the day, we need to stop treating the search for disappeared children, missing and disappeared children, as a program. Canada has a legal obligation to support the finding of these truths, and they should not be putting caps and directing communities what the funding can be used for and what it cannot be used for.
Right. Yeah, you're correct. They haven't made that public. The reason I asked you that question to anyone really, and it's been asked a few times, but the answer the minister has said is, there's never really been an amount. It's not a line item in the budget and whatnot. So, I mean, would you say that, I guess, in terms that there shouldn't really be any cap, that the money should just be available to communities that want to, if it's a verified search that they're doing, they should make the money available?
Absolutely. I mean, you can look at the history of the funding and how at first they were putting restrictions on what it could be used for. So, for example, communities were not allowed to use the funding to hire lawyers to negotiate their access agreements to the archives. Communities were not allowed to use the funding to do DNA testing because the government was in the process of developing its own DNA strategy. And so with advocacy from survivors and communities and my office, they changed those rules. And then they seem to be backpedaling again. With the cuts that they did this summer, they were telling communities that they could not use the funding to do commemoration or to put markers on the graves. And, and so we're now, they've said they've lifted the cap. But it's really not clear what you can use the funds for. Communities are being told, well, speak to your policy analysts at the government. And it seems that they're doing it on a case-by-case basis according to each community's needs. But I'm not hearing from the government that they're going to allow or permit these searches to be Indigenous-led. These should not be government-led searches. They should be community-led, survivor-led, Indigenous-led, which means communities make the decisions on where to put the resources, whether that's gathering survivor statements, gathering records, doing ground searches with the technologies, and utilizing it for the technologies that they need to use based on what the ground is telling them that they need to use.
Yes, and the other thing actually the Secretariat, Survivor Secretariat told us when they were here on Monday also is that because of that the government hasn't been clear about the process, or they announced it after the budget and they weren't getting calls back from agents at ISC, they said that really no money for searches has flowed in this fiscal year, and there's been a gap now that's, and the portal, the deadline's November, so they say that nothing will really be happening till after that. Is that what you've heard from communities, is that they've had trouble getting any money in this fiscal year to do searches?
No, there has been money that has flowed to communities. There are communities that have multi-year contracts and money has flowed. The government has been providing me with the list of communities that are receiving funding since I started my position. And increasingly every month when I get the list, there's more communities that have received funding. It's the new communities, it's the new applicants that are really having the problems, because they didn't put in funding proposals when it was a $5 million cap, or when they lifted the restrictions. And so we're really going to start to see with the new proposals and contracts that are being put in place what Canada is really up to with the funding.
Now, from what we understand, that your term's been extended till this fall, I guess, and in coming weeks you'll have a report coming out. Is there anything that can give us a hint of what might be in your upcoming final report?
I'll be releasing my report on October 29th, and I encourage everyone to watch on the live webcast. Clearly, funding, I discuss funding in my final report and echo my recommendation in the interim report for long-term sustainable funding. But what's really important, and I frame my final report in this way, this is about obligations. This is not a funding program. This is not something that Canada gets to choose to decide whether to support or not support. Canada has international legal obligations to support these searches, to support the finding of truth. And in my final report, I speak extensively about those obligations and what Canada needs to do to live up to those obligations. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is very clear that Canada has to support communities with the repatriation and protection of these burials. And so we really need to hold the government's feet to the fire in this way.
And maybe I'll just ask you quickly too, your role, I mean, you've been outspoken, your criticism of the government has put you on a couple occasions in conflict with the government. Is that something you foresaw, or do you think that's just part of your role, I guess, that you were appointed to do?
Well, the elders and the survivors told me I have to be the voice for the children, or one of the voices for the children. And so sometimes I have to speak the difficult truths that people don't like to hear. I think I walked into this position knowing that it would be a difficult job and that I would have to have these difficult conversations. I mean, when we're talking about finding families' loved ones, we can't be shy. We can't be worried about our careers. We can't be worried about, where I'm going to end up because I'm pissing off people in power. This is about finding the missing and disappeared children. And I will continue to speak up and be one of the voices for those children and those families.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there, but look very forward to your next report. And thanks once again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Up next, we'll talk to Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay about the 9 deaths of Indigenous people at the hands of police in the past month. Welcome back. 9 Indigenous people have died at the hands of police forces across the country in the past month. These numbers are staggering, but in many ways not surprising for those who follow this issue, as Indigenous people have long suffered a fractured and tense relationship with law enforcement. In her latest article, Hill Times columnist Rose LeMay challenges all Canadians to do better in the spirit of reconciliation. She joins me today. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Good morning.
Okay, so this is an issue I know that you and many others have tackled before, but it almost appears to me, if I'm correct in this piece, that it's almost as if you're sort of at your wits' end about this issue and are kind of making a plea to all of Canada to collectively wake up. Am I correct?
Yes, you are correct. It occurred to me while I was writing the article last week that I I think I've written this article before. And I actually was wondering, wow, should I just put in another article? Let's just repeat the column from 18 months ago. Let's repeat it from 2020. Nothing has changed. The federal government has committed to putting in some kind of new accountability measure for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I think the devil will be in the details in that. But provincial territorial police forces have yet to even come to the table on reconciliation. So what do we need? I'm actually scared to ask the question, what do we need to happen for that to change their minds? I don't even want to see what that would be.
Yes, and you also mentioned in the article that that police forces should apologize to Indigenous people. I thought I would ask you, do you think we're anywhere near close to this happening? And have police forces, even in recent years, made any serious advancement on reconciliation, in your opinion?
Are we close to police forces or the police sector writ large, recognizing the wrongs they've done in the past and potentially are still doing? No, I think that day is not in the near future. I don't even see that police forces recognize the role that the sector has played historically. I'm not seeing that knowledge and capacity. Yes, there are definitely pockets of leadership for reconciliation. I think they're few and far between. And I don't think they have the influence that we hope they do, given the sector is just so resistant to change. I think the system of police is almost too much to overcome for these rare leaders, which is why we need Canadian citizens to demand accountability.
Now, I'd like to move on just briefly to a number of provincial election campaigns that are going on, and I know one that you're watching in New Brunswick, and a particular candidate made some bizarre statements recently in a comparison with what she was talking about with residential school survivors. Did you want to talk about that for a few minutes?
Yes, I would. I would. So, a candidate named Sherry Wilson in New Brunswick election compared Policy 713, so provincial policy that LGBTQ2S students within schools could change their pronouns without parental consent. I'm not getting into details. Ms. Wilson made the comparison that lack of parental consent to residential schools, and it was blatant residential schools denial and an incredible statement of racism. It essentially blamed Indigenous parents in the past for residential schools, which is not the case at all. So it is a point of residential school denialism. She has not met any consequence yet from her provincial party or her provincial party leader in this election, which brings me around to Leah Gazin's bill that we should and must make residential school denialism illegal. We need to raise that point that this is not just a lack of knowledge or lack of compassion. It is truly hurtful, and we shouldn't put up with this in our society.
Yeah, and it is a larger issue. We've heard conservatives in the House here use that before to lack of a better word, their own personal pet issue, and then do this comparison. Is this part of a larger strategy, do you think, to sort of manipulate opinion, or is it just a cluelessness of the history, or what do you think is going on here? Because this is not the first time this has happened, and it's happened a few times in the past year.
It has happened a few times. I'm not entirely sure if we know exactly what the intent of Miss Wilson at this time was. I'm not sure it matters. I'm more concerned about the impact that she has on public discussions and discourse, the impact she's had on Indigenous peoples within New Brunswick, especially for survivors. She made this comment on National Reconciliation Day. So, did she think that she was perhaps building on a level of compassion? No. That showed no compassion whatsoever for Indigenous peoples, her comment. I'm not entirely sure if the people she was speaking to would know enough around the depth, the dearth of knowledge, sorry, that really was behind that comment. I don't even know where it came from. I do know a bit about the impact though, and that was harsh.
Yes, it's been a bizarre election campaign there on many fronts. I haven't been following it too closely, but I know that it's a tight election campaign, and the premier there, Blaine Higgs, of course, has landed himself in hot water on a whole bunch of issues. So it should be interesting to see what happens when the voters go to the polls. But we'll have to land it there. But I know you're very busy this time of year, everybody, Parliament back and everything, and I'm sure you're busy. But really appreciate you taking the time, as always, to talk to us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
After the break, we'll talk to NDP MP Nikki Ashton about a Northern Manitoba First Nations long fight with the federal government for safe drinking water that has now ended up in the Supreme Court. Welcome back. For years, the Shamattawa First Nation in Northern Manitoba has been under a boil water advisory, and the community remains without a functional water treatment plant. This has led to a class action lawsuit against the federal government for failure to provide safe drinking water. The community is in NDP Nikki Ashton's riding, and she has been lobbying hard on their behalf, including this week in Parliament. Ms. Ashton joins me today from her constituency in Thompson, Manitoba. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, Nikki, and thanks for joining us again.
Great to be back. Thank you.
So maybe you can describe for us firsthand, because I know this community is in your constituency, just how bad the situation is in Shamattawa concerning water.
Mm-hmm. Well, the situation is very much, I would say, parallel, and many describe it as third world living conditions. Shamattawa is a remote First Nation here in Northern Manitoba that for years has been fighting for access to clean drinking water, new water treatment plant, a way of making sure that homes have access to clean drinking water. And this is also a community that's been very clear that that the lack of clean drinking water, in addition to the housing crisis, in addition to the lack of investment in infrastructure in the community, has led to serious social challenges and, of course, health challenges. And I just want to say before we go on, this is also the community of Johnson Redhead, the little 6-year-old boy that unfortunately went missing for days, and when he was found deceased. And yesterday, the funeral took place in his home community of Shamattawa. I know all of our thoughts go out to his family and to the community. And many have said, coming out of this tragedy, that we also need to be talking about the immense challenges like the access to clean drinking water and housing and infrastructure that Shamattawa faces. Here we see Shamattawa taking this fight to the biggest court of our country, the Supreme Court, and they're fighting Canada, who under the Liberal government has said repeatedly that they were deeply committed to moving away from boiled water advisories to ensuring that all First Nations have clean drinking water. But when it comes to Shamattawa and the 59 other First Nations that are part of this class action lawsuit, it is very clear that Canada has not delivered the goods, and the fact that they refuse to settle with Shamattawa, find a solution with Shamattawa and other First Nations, and instead are continuing to fight them in court is absolutely appalling. And I would just say shame on Canada at this time.
Right, and from it was noted in some of the stuff that your staffers gave me, and also that just reading the lawsuit briefly, it appears like they don't think that or the government doesn't think they have any legal responsibility to provide safe drinking water, and this seems to go beyond what the Prime Minister or ministers say.
Well, it's particularly shocking what Canada's lawyers are arguing as they fight Shamattawa and the 59 other First Nations. Exactly. They're saying that, for example, any commitments that have been made to remove boiled water advisories and ensure clean drinking water to First Nations was just only context specific. So they didn't actually mean it. And that's basically what the Liberals are arguing, that the federal government does not have a legal obligation. I mean, this is absurd. First of all, let's be clear, it's 2024. Canada is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The federal government has a fiduciary obligation to First Nations, treaty obligations to First Nations. So shirking a responsibility to one of the most fundamental human rights, which is clean drinking water, is disturbing. But then to go on and say that any commitments made by the Liberals, which have been made repeatedly during elections, after elections, before elections, that somehow they don't actually count, or that it's not actually a real commitment, is also shocking. And I also want to say, and I want to bring forward the fact that Chief Hill has also shared how he used the word humiliating. His experience was being cross-examined by Canada, and he made very clear that he and the council, as chief, and the council were almost made to feel by Canada that it was their fault that Shamattawa doesn't have adequate infrastructure for clean water. Again, that is not the responsibility of the First Nation. Shamattawa has done everything possible to fight for clean drinking water, to work with the federal government on clean drinking water. And the federal government has dropped the ball for them and for other First Nations, particularly those under long-term boiled water advisories. So however you look at it, the bottom line is what the Liberal government is doing is the opposite of reconciliation right now. The fact that they are fighting Shamattawa and other First Nations in court on clean drinking water is abhorrent. And what we're saying is stop fighting Shamattawa and the other 59 First Nations part of this lawsuit. Let's find a solution to and make the investments necessary as soon as possible to make sure that Shamattawa and other communities have the clean drinking water they deserve.
Now, as you know, the government introduced Bill C-61 last year. That's the First Nations Clean Water Act. Will that make a difference for communities like Shamattawa, do you think?
Well, it's interesting because now the Liberals are, anytime you bring up clean drinking water or the challenges or the Supreme Court fight, they keep going to Bill C-61, which the Liberals took forever to bring to committee. It's now in committee. I've been working with my colleague, our critic, MP Laurie Idlout, as part of these hearings at committee. It's important work, but let's be clear: the crisis in Shamattawa is right now. It's not something to be fixed if and when there's legislative changes. The federal government has the power to ensure clean drinking water for Shamattawa and the other 59 First Nations in the class action lawsuit now. There's no need to dither or frankly play political games. And I'm very disappointed that yesterday in Parliament, when I asked Minister Haidu about Shamattawa's fight for clean water, and I pointed to how disingenuous the Liberals' commitments are to First Nations on this front, she didn't mention Shamattawa in her response. She didn't commit to supporting Shamattawa in her response, and immediately shifted to Bill C-61, which sounds like the Liberal band-aid to everything that we're talking about, and simply isn't the case. The federal government has the resources to fix the problem in Shamattawa, to work with Shamattawa First Nation to ensure clean drinking water. What we're clearly lacking is frankly political will and the desire to continue games, promising one thing to First Nations and yet directing federal lawyers to fight them in court.
Well, we'll have to end it there, but thanks once again for joining us today, Nikki.
Thank you very much.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.